Quote, at the same time, others pointed out that Sudan has exaggerated its knowledge of terrorist networks and activities in order to impress America. As one person put it, the United States government doesn't care as long as Khartoum says it is fighting terrorism. Some respondents pointed to the government's apparent ignorance of some of the university campus-based activities of sympathizers of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and alleged that the government was in the dark when it came to the operations themselves, only discovering their existence after media publicity. Quote. What we see is from the quote of Ali Berji in March of 2018, published by the United States Institute of Peace, is that Sudan is a country that seems more intent on trying to cozy up to the United States and impress the United States for its own benefit than it is actually concerned with helping to fight terrorism within its borders. Now today in this speech, we're going to be looking at why the United States are important, why at the end of the day, the United States should act in a way that upholds its interests. But why we're also going to see why the affirmative team's policy is simply too fast, moving forward too simply irrationally without taking a step to actually consider all the interests in play. Simply put, they look at one specific issue, which is the idea of Russian influence. Now, first of all, we haven't seen how they would solve it, but more importantly, they ignore the broader interests at stake. Whereas if you vote for the current system, you're not voting for inaction. You're not voting for a passive response. Rather, you're voting for the State Department's current trajectory, one where we're going to be proceeding tentatively with relations towards Sudan in a way that examines all the interests in a careful and deliberate process. In this speech, we're going to be looking at a number of main points, ultimately seeing how the United States is in fact pursuing the best policy towards Sudan that helps to uphold all of our interests, and why this is a reason to vote for the status quo in favor of the affirmative team's more hasty policy. Let's first look at the issue of inheritance. This is debate a term for whether or not the current system is addressing the problem. Now, if we look to the current system, we see that the State Department is aware of the interests in Sudan and is taking steps. According to the U.S. Department of State in 2017, quote, on October 6th, 2017, the United States lifted economic sanctions on Sudan due to progress the government made through the 5-track engagement plan, which includes the process to evaluate Sudan's counterterrorism cooperation with the United States, unquote. What we see is that the United States State Department is already on a track with the Sudanese government to progressively expand and explore the counterterrorism cooperation. We're going to do this under the current system, and we are currently involved in this process. Further, we see that this process is in fact beneficial to the United States because it allows us to actually check Sudan's regime and actually make sure that they're making progress. Africa analyst Magnus Taylor writes in February of 2018 that, quote, Khartoum's optimism for quick normalization of its relations with the United States after economic sanctions repeal was premature. It said, indeed, the United States has been clear that this would not happen without further tangible progress from the Sudanese government, including improvements to its human rights record, unquote. So what we see is that in the current system, the United States is being more careful. It is actually expecting more progress than simply face value improvements. Essentially, the State Department is being very deliberate about this process. All this to show how we are actually taking this very carefully. One more quote from Michelle Rosenberg actually goes to show how the United States, in a diplomatic effort, actually lifted sanctions and currently now allows U.S. persons to engage in most transactions without the need for specific or general licenses to engage in Sudan, unquote. What we see is essentially the United States is dealing with Sudan in a very careful and deliberate process, and this is good. We see that we shouldn't just jump to conclusions, and we shouldn't rush this process. Now listen, if the State Department ultimately arrives at the same place the affirmative team would want us to arrive, then that's just fine. But we can know that we've done it in a more careful and cautious manner than rushing ahead and looking at one specific issue, which is the issue of Russia, an issue which the affirmative team can't even solve. Now before I get to solvency, I want to address the issue of significance. Now the issue of significance is whether or not Sudan has actually reformed or whether or not there are still significant problems in the country of Syria, and Sudan, and therefore there is still a legitimate reason to maintain the designation. Now, they read a piece of evidence in their speech which said that, quote, there was no indication that the Sudanese government tolerated or assisted terrorist organizations within its borders in 2016. However, this language is very limited and very qualified. And when we look to the broader aspects and the broader behavior of the Sudanese government, they still have active relations to terror. As my partner related, they actively support terror and turn a blind eye to terrorist activity or supporters of terror in their own state. For example, Ali Berji, who I quoted at the beginning of the speech, writes that, quote, Sudanese citizens pointed to the governments allowing some supporters of the Islamic State, notably Dr. Muhammad Ali Abdallah al-Ghazuli, to continue working freely in Khartoum, unquote. What we see is that not necessarily active support for terror in Sudan, but rather a passive permission of terror to flourish in the country. This simply says that the United States has a reasonable interest in actually maintaining the terrorist designation, the terror-sponsored designation, until further reforms are made. We also see that the country of Sudan is simply not a good country to deal with. The president of Sudan himself is in fact under an investigation for war crimes, according to Nick Robertson in 2008, and we see that they've been involved in significant problems as well as her relationship with China. They're also looking to a cooperation with China. Simply put, there are significant problems with the country of Sudan, and there are significant reasons why we should maintain the designation. Now, I want to address the issue quickly of solvency. The issue of solvency, whether or not the problem of the affirmative team, which is the relationship with Russia, is addressed by their plan. And simply put, there's no evidence that by passing the affirmative team's plan, we'll be able to better uphold our interests in Sudan, and especially better than the current system. We haven't seen evidence that by rushing this process, we'll be able to better protect our interests, better than what the current systems are doing. Again, I come back to the fact that the current system is taking into our interest account, and is performing and progressing with caution and care. Under the affirmative team's plan, we simply rush that process with no evidence that it is beneficial to the United States. That brings us to the disadvantages of the affirmative team's plan, showing why it hurts the process to rush it and to go too fast. Now, the fundamental mindset that we have to understand is immediate versus progressive change. Under progressive change, the United States still maintains some of its leverage and therefore can actually incentivize reform. Whereas if we rush this process and normalize too quick, we let some of our interests slide, and that's ultimately a harm to our interests. John Hirsch writes in 2017, that, quote, if U.S. officials do not press their Sudanese counterparts to improve on a number of issues, especially human rights and humanitarian access, it will be a lost opportunity for pushing the regime to do better when it is finally some leverage to do so, unquote. Basically saying if we rush this process, we lose our leverage to enact reform, and that hurts the United States' interests in improving Sudan. We also see that from John Pendergrass, quote, to accelerate the U.S.-Sudan normalization with this imploding economy and increasing repression as an intensely volatile backdrop would be severely ill-timed at best and would harm U.S. interests at worst. What we see is that it's not in U.S. interests to rush this process. Rather, it's better for the United States State Department to progress progressively and with caution, rather than rushing the process. And finally, we see, and the final disadvantage is that we actually see that the Sudanese government is not reformed. The Sudanese government simply has not reformed. John Pendergrass goes on to talk about how they actively involve themselves in repression of religion. The Sudanese government, he says, continues to harshly repress Christians and some minority Muslim sects. The churches have been burned, priests attacked, and congregations harassed. The end of all this speech, and what it comes back to, is the idea of U.S. interests. What system best upholds interests? One where we look at one problem, the case of Russia, and a case where the affirmative team cannot even prove solvency, or the system of the status quo, in which the State Department, whose body it is and whose purpose it is to uphold the United States interests, to engage in this process more deliberately and more cautiously. We as the negative team believe that the status quo is addressing the system, but is doing so in a better manner, and thus it should be preferred over the affirmative team's plan. Thank you, and I now